Hello, this is Mike from Urban Legends and Mythology. On this episode, we are taking a deep dive to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and we are unraveling the mysteries of one of its most famous inhabitants. This is the tale of the Titanic. So, for those of you who have been living under a rock your whole life or have only ever seen that 1997 film about the ill-fated ship, you're probably wondering, why was this ship so important and why was this ship so famous? Why has it had such a lasting effect in popular culture? And to be perfectly honest, it was simply due to the fact that nothing like that disaster had ever happened before. Now, Titanic wasn't the first ship to sink on its maiden voyage, nor was it the first ship to experience some kind of maritime disaster. As long as there have been humans building ships, ships have sank. But it's this particular disaster which really spurs major changes in maritime safety. This is even why on cruise ships today you're required to go to that muster drill where they teach you how to put on a life vest and get into a lifeboat and stuff. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As always, let's start at the beginning. So it actually all starts in 1907. And White Star Line is this British shipping company who focuses on shipping cargo and passengers across the Atlantic, so from the British Empire over to the Americas. And while other shipping lines at the time, rival shipping lines, focused on speed, White Star decided they wanted to focus more on luxury, so they wanted to give their passengers a luxury cruise. This way they could attract a very wealthy clientele. Obviously, if you're a company, you gotta make money. That's the best way to make money, is bilking rich people out of theirs. But White Star does have a bit of a problem because one of their rival companies called the Cunard Line, which is still in operation today, they launched these twin luxury ships called the Lusitania and the Mauretania, and these ships are fast and luxurious. So in 1907, White Star's chairman, a man named J. Bruce Ismay, is having a meeting with the infamous J.P. Morgan. You may have heard of his bank. Now, J.P. Morgan is important with this all because he owns a significant portion of basically White Star's parent corporation, the International Mercantile Marine Company. So they're having this discussion about how do we compete with these new fast luxury liners. And Ismay comes up with a clever idea stating, well, we don't really need to focus on, competing with speed. Why don't we outcompete them by offering them the most opulent and largest luxury liners on the ocean? And this brainstorming session results in the formation of these new Olympic-class ocean liners. They were going to launch 3 ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. And these 3 new ships were not only going to be the best of the best when it comes to luxury, but they were also going to be the largest ships in the world at the time, as well as still being fast enough that they could still offer weekly trips from England to New York. So at this point, I must say, I'm about to go into almost 40 minutes of rambling about the construction and just the design and the layout of this ship. So if you don't want to sit through all that, you can skip to timestamp, I think it's 51:11, and you can pick up right before the maiden voyage sets off. So that leads us to the design phase of these new Olympic-class ocean liners. So the ship was essentially designed by the best designers from Harland & Wolff. Harland & Wolff was the company that built the ships. And on July 29th, 1908, Harland & Wolff presents the drawings to Bruce Ismay and other White Star Line executives, and they approve of the designs. And about 2 days later, it was authorized to put into construction these 2 ships. The Olympic was originally called Hull 400, and the Titanic was Hull 401. So the Titanic, which is our star tonight, was designed to be 882 feet and 9 inches, or 269.06 commie meters, with a maximum breadth of 92 feet 6 inches, or 28.19 meters, which made it the largest ship of its time, and a lot of people say it was the largest ship ever built up till this point. The ship consisted of 10 decks, 8 of which were for passenger use, and when it launched, it was considered the pinnacle of luxury. But we're jumping a little ahead. Let's get into the building phase of Titanic now, because there were a lot of omens that happened during the building phase that suggested that this ship might be cursed. So to start off with, the sheer size and ambition of these Olympic-class vessels led to a series of major engineering challenges because something of this size had never been attempted before. It was to the point where they had to completely redesign the shipyard in which these two vessels were being built. So the construction site was in a place called Queen's Island, which is now the Titanic quarter in Belfast Harbor. And the Harland and Wolff Company, they had to actually demolish 3 existing slipways in order to build 2 new ones, the largest ever constructed up till that time. And this is before the first piece of steel was even being forged. They also had to have this enormous gantry built, and this thing was massive. It stood at 69 meters tall. It was 270 feet wide and 840 feet long. It weighed more than 6,000 tons. And they even had to import a separate floating crane from Germany that was capable of lifting over 200 tons. So this was a massive project to build these ships. Now, Olympic and Titanic's construction took place virtually in parallel to each other. The Olympic's keel was laid down on 16 December 1908 and Titanic's on 31 March 1909. It took about 26 months to build these ships just to have them to the point where they were worthy for sea trials. So the keel was laid down. That's considered kind of the backbone of the ship. Then the frames of the hull, which form the ribs, are laid down. Eventually you have a skeleton on which you can attach the hull plates and the double bottom, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into every step of ship design. If you are really interested, just Google how to build a ship of this era. But to give a simple size of scale of this thing, the 2,000 hull plates were single pieces of rolled steel, mostly up to 6 feet wide and 30 feet long. Each one of them weighed between 2.5 and 3 tons. Now, they didn't have like welding techniques like we have today, like commercial arc welding, for example. This hull was held together with over 3 million rivets made of iron and steel. And to put that in perspective, if you take the weight of the iron and steel rivets alone, that is equivalent to 1,200 tons of steel and iron. And each one of those rivets was either hammered in by hand or with a hydraulic kind of hammer. But this being the early 1900s, the manufacture and quality of this steel, while perfectly fine for the time, didn't really live up to like standards of today, for example. It's been pretty much conclusively accepted that the steel plate used in the construction of the hulls of this ship had the tendency to become especially brittle in cold conditions, which would obviously become a factor later in our story. But even during this building phase, these initial building phases, tragedy would happen because during this time there's no OSHA, there are no safety inspectors at the work site, there are no hard hats, and there's probably very little regulation involving anything dangerous, which it's kind of ironic, the British Empire not regulating something. Hell, in Britain you have to fill out 5 forms if you sneeze, but regulations in industry didn't really apply or exist back then. And it leads to a series of mishaps and injuries and deaths on the work site. Now, this comes as no surprise. An industry like shipbuilding is going to have injuries and deaths. Shipyards, by their very nature, are very dangerous places to work. And it was to the point where, the guys in the accounting department actually worked out an algorithm for this. I think it was roughly estimated that for every 100,000 pounds spent, a worker would die. Now, Titanic actually cost around $7.5 million to build in 1912, which is around $198 million today. So the fact that only 8 people died during the construction of the ship was actually pretty good according to this algorithm. But everybody who lives around and near these shipyards know that, you're going to get injured working on these ships. During construction of Titanic between 1909 and 1912, at least 7 workers died, 28 sustained severe injuries, and 218 suffered less serious injuries. Now, these were injuries that were bad enough where the guy was probably taken out of work for a couple of days, so they had to report it and get compensated. So it would have been like a loss of a finger, maybe a rotator cuff or shoulder injury from working on the riveting crew. or people being struck by falling objects like tools or rivets or whatever. Those were considered the less serious injuries. Injuries to the head, eyes, fingers, and lower extremities were a regular occurrence, including flash burns from these primitive welding tools. A lot of people went deaf from the noise of those impact hammers that were used on the riveting crews, and even inhalation of toxic gases from the manufacture of these ships. This was all the minor stuff. Now, these guys weren't sissies. They weren't reporting even more minor injuries like you accidentally smack your thumb with a hammer. Nobody's going to give a flip about that. But the vast majority of these injuries were injuries like I just described. Now, the 28 sustained injuries, these were like crippling, life-altering injuries. So these come from accounts of normally falls or accidents on site in which the person possibly had to have a limb amputated. You get a finger amputated, that's fine. You can heal and be at work again in a week. But you get a leg amputated, you're pretty much out of work. And during this era, say if you fell off of the top deck of a ship you were building and you land on concrete 50 feet down and completely shatter your leg, they're amputating it. Other amputations would happen during the accident, so these iron plates that they were riveting to the hulls, remember these things weighed almost 3 tons. And the thickness of these things was only like 2 to 3 centimeters at best. So these were thin, sharp steel plates. So if one fell and landed on your leg, that was like a hot knife going through butter. Now, is that survivable? Yeah, it's entirely survivable, but that's going to be life-changing, life-altering. That's going to be in these more severe injuries. And then there were the 7, or some people argue 8 deaths. And out of these deaths, to be honest, most of them were from falls. Now, of these deaths, only 5 of them are directly related to the construction of the Titanic. And 4 of those 5 are the direct results of falls, where they landed on their head, they had a fracture to the skull, and they died almost immediately or shortly after. One other death was attributed to a timber strut which had fell and crushed a guy named James Dobbin when the ship was launched on 31 May 1911. And the 2 other deaths seem to be attributed to just the shipyard itself in the workshops, but these workshops were believed to be working on the Titanic project. So I guess that's a little bit of backstory about the shipyard. It was a very brutal and dangerous place to work, but hey, it was a job. You could make up to £2 a week working in these shipyards. Just to give some context into the nature of shipyard life, James Connolly writes this in The Reconquest of Ireland, 1915. Our shipyards offer up a daily sacrifice of life and limb on the altar of capitalism. The clang of the ambulance bell is one of the most familiar daily sounds on the streets between our shipyards and our hospitals. The public reads and passes on, but fails to comprehend the totality of suffering involved. But it means all lives ruined, fair prospects blighted, homes devastated, crippled wrecks of manhood upon the streets, or widows and orphans to eat the bread of poverty and pauperism. And in the shipyard itself, even first aid was very basic, very rudimentary. And this is an account from a former shipyard employee recalling what first aid was like back then. We had sort of a first aid depot in the main yard, and it would have been about 12 feet square. It was all tiled, and the man who ran it was called Washing Soda. He'd sell you a few packets of cigarettes and bars of chocolate just to make a few bob, but he was daft on washing soda. If you went in with a slight injury, he would have washed it down with washing soda and say, "Now when you get home tonight, wash it down with washing soda." And the story was that if a lead plate fell on you and amputated your leg, he would have said, "Bathe it in washing soda." I never knew his name. I never heard him getting other than washing soda. So it seems that even the first aid guy at this facility was probably just some guy they picked off the street and said, "Hey, you want a job?" But even despite all that, still a lucrative place to work. £2 a week. So if we do some basic conversion, £1 at the time was the equivalent to about $5 American. So that's $10 a week, which has the spending power of around $331 today in 2024. So you're not doing all that great, but you're not starving to death either. So to a lot of these people, the risk would be worth the reward. But I'm a little off topic now. Let's get back to the building of Titanic. So Titanic was a super ultra modern ocean liner. liner. And this means they spared no expense when it came to technology and lavish accommodations. So just to power this ship, Titanic had 3 engines, each powering one of those 3 propellers on the back. The port and starboard propellers were propelled by 2 reciprocating 4-cylinder triple expansion steam engines, which had a combined output of 30,000 horsepower. The third engine was the centrally placed low-pressure Parsons turbine engine, which had an output of 16,000 horsepower. So you're looking at a total combined output of 46,000 horsepower. And they use these 2 different type of engines for a very specific reason. So by combining the 2 reciprocating engines with a turbine engine, the overall fuel usage could be reduced and the motive power increased while using the same amount of steam. Now these 2 reciprocating engines, they were massive. They were 19 meters long and weighed 720 tons. That wasn't even including the 195-ton bed plate. And remember, there are 2 of those on this ship. Now, these are steam engines, so they were powered by boilers that would burn coal. And this steam was produced in a total of 29 boilers. Now, 24 of these were the double-ended boilers, and the other 5 were single-ended boilers, which, to be honest, I really don't know what the difference is. I tried looking it up, but all I can really gather is that the double-ended ones seem to save on weight and space. But if anybody out there is an expert in boiler or steam technology, I guess enlighten me, because that concept is kind of over my head. So these boilers, they were massive. They were 4.80 meters in diameter and 6.1 meters long, each one weighing 91.5 tons and capable of holding 48.5 tons of water. They also contained 159 total furnaces in which, the coal would be stoked in and that would create the steam, and the steam would go up the pipes and power the engines and blah, blah, blah. And the steam that was created from the exhaust leaving the reciprocating engines was then fed into the turbine. From there, it was passed into a surface condenser to increase the efficiency of the turbine so that the steam could be condensed back into water and reused. And if that sounds complicated, yes it is, but it's this very efficient enclosed system that's powering this third engine, increasing the overall horsepower, and there you go. And to give some context as how massive this all was, over 6,611 tons of coal was carried in Titanic's bunkers, with another 1,092 tons held in Hold 3. The furnaces then required over 600 tons of coal per day to be shoveled into them by hand, requiring the services of 176 firemen working around the clock. And this job created 100 tons of ash today that was basically ejected into the sea. And all of this was going to power those 3 massive propellers and the electrical power plant aboard the ship. Now, the electrical power plant at the time, it was capable of producing more power than an average city power station at the time. This power station consisted of 4 400 kilowatt steam-driven electric generators, plus 2 30-kilowatt auxiliary generators for emergency use. Now, it just so happens that this power plant was also located in the stern near the engines, which I guess in hindsight was kind of a good idea because it did keep the electricity and the lights on in the ship up until the final minutes before it completely sank. But aside from the massiveness of the mechanics of the ship, one thing that they really boasted in advertising this ship was their new safety features. And the huge thing that they boasted about was the 16 compartments that were divided by 15 bulkheads that extended above the waterline. Now, these compartments were basically designed so any combination of them, up to I believe 4, can be completely filled with water and still keep the ship afloat. In between the compartments, there were these watertight doors that could be dropped in the case of a flooding emergency. And they were supposed to basically seal off and contain that damaged area of the ship. And these were kind of advertised as a great new idea, and to be honest, it was a great new idea. The idea of sealing off a damaged area so the rest of the ship doesn't flood is very smart and forward thinking. However, to be honest, and in this case, that really only goes so far. As I said, I think up to 4 of them could be filled with water. And pretty much after you got beyond that, the ship was just gonna sink. But at the time, nobody thought that this ship would ever sink. Let's remember, this is a cruise ship, the biggest and most luxurious one ever built. And its safety features exceeded the regulations of the day. And it was designed to be essentially a floating palace, a floating Ritz hotel. So nobody ever thought anything bad would ever happen to this ship. And it was through their kind of advertising of the new safety features and rumor and word of mouth that the general idea that the ship was unsinkable gets out there into the public ear. And while White Star Line never once said that the ship was unsinkable, they're in the shipbuilding industry, the idea of the infamous unsinkable ship just becomes the general reality. But as a further boast to their safety standards, they actually exceeded the safety standards of the required amount of lifeboats you needed on a ship. If Titanic had done the bare minimum per regulation, there would have only been 12 lifeboats. But Titanic boasted 20 lifeboats total. Now that's a note of contention. Everybody says, well, Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats. Why didn't Titanic have more lifeboats? Because technically Titanic could have carried up to 64 wooden lifeboats, which would have had the carrying capacity for 4,000 passengers. And the decision to only go with 20 lifeboats is actually kind of a simple one. The lifeboats weren't meant to keep afloat the whole population at once during an emergency. The lifeboats were intended to take a number of passengers and move them over to a rescuing boat, return, gather up the rest of the passengers and crew, and ferry over the remainder over to a rescuing boat. The general idea was, in such an emergency, there'd probably be other boats in the area. The ship would be sinking slow enough that it would be possible to ferry these passengers over to a rescuing boat. So there wasn't really much need for these additional lifeboats. But then again, a disaster on the scale of the Titanic disaster wasn't something anybody thought would ever happen. So Titanic carries 20 lifeboats. 14 are the standard wooden Harland and Wolff lifeboats with a capacity of 65 people each. 4 of them were what considered to be collapsible lifeboats, so they had like wooden bottoms with canvas sides. They had a capacity of 40 people each. And then, and I didn't know this until just recently, they had 2 cutters, which are very fast, agile little boats. Every lifeboat had things like food, water, blankets, and a spare life belt, and they even had lifeline ropes in order to pull up any passengers who might have gone overboard into the water. Now, I'll get more into the lifeboats later as I get to the subject of the disaster itself, but to put it out there, they actually exceeded the minimum requirements for safety for the day. And Titanic was built on the reputation of not only being massive, opulent, luxurious, but it was built on a reputation of being extremely safe. In the unlikely event of an emergency, you were safe in White Star Line's hands. Of course, no ship is truly safe without a good telecommunications system, and Titanic boasted one of the most advanced telecommunication systems at the time, the radio telegraph. And once again, when it comes to technology and opulence, White Star didn't spare any expense. So they actually leased their radio telegraph equipment from the Marconi International Marine Communication Company, along with 2 of their own employees, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, who were the operators. So the ship was essentially equipped with a state-of-the-art 5-kilowatt rotary spark gap transmitter with the wireless telegraph call sign MGY. Now, communication was still in Morse code at this time, but the damn thing worked. It had a broadcast radius of over 350 miles or 563 kilometers, and it can operate on the short wavelength frequency of 1,000 kilohertz, which would be perfect for other smaller ships in the general area who are using these shorter antennas with these shorter wavelengths. However, its normal operating frequency was 500 kilohertz, which allowed them to send these Marconi grams back and forth. And these Marconi grams could be sent 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, it was primarily used for passengers to send and receive messages from, their destination or where they're coming from or whatever. But another very important use for this was the gathering of weather reports and ice warnings, reports of what other ships were in the area, which would allow them to navigate a little bit better. But this was considered state-of-the-art luxury at this time, because sending a message wirelessly through the air, that was like magic to these people. But then we get down to the sheer opulence of this ship, and to best describe that, we have to start with the first class accommodations. And these accommodations were meant to meet the highest standard of luxury because they're expecting to get like captains of industry. We have to remember this is the tail end of the Gilded Age, and in England it's the Edwardian Age by now. But these people riding in first class who've paid all this money for this ticket to go on this voyage, they want the best of the best. They want the fine Parisian dining, which was kind of the trend at the time. They want to be able to sit in a beautiful lounge and smoke a cigar, or relax in their private stateroom, which is beautifully decorated to their tastes, and hell, might even have running water and an ensuite. They want to be pampered and be able to relax and drink fine wine and all that stuff that rich people back then used to do. They essentially wanted a floating Ritz hotel, and if you know the Ritz, you know what I'm talking about. The whole first class accommodations were designed for superior luxury and relaxation. And even in first class, you had the standard cabins and you had the suites. But even the standards had nothing standard about it. They had beautiful horsehair sofas, you could have double beds, porcelain wash basins, and in the first class rooms, you could even push a button to send a signal to have your servant come in. And although the entire ship was centrally heated, the first class accommodations offered additional electric heaters in each of the rooms. And the suites were even better. They had private entrances, separate servants' quarters, your own personal ensuite or bathroom for us Americans. And each one was lavishly decorated in the style of a different historical period. In total, there were 39 of these suites, and they were located on B and C deck. But the most opulent, the most splendid suites on the Titanic were the 4 parlor suites. They were located on B and C decks, just aft or behind the grand staircase landings. So basically you come out of your suite and you're right there at the grand staircase. Now the 2 on B deck, they were advertised as deluxe parlor suites or promenade suites because they contained 50 feet of your own promenade deck where you can go out, walk around. It's private. It's kind of like having your own private balcony but bigger. So the parlor suites each contained 2 large bedrooms, 2 walk-in wardrobes, a private bathroom, a lavatory, and a spacious sitting room. They were reserved for the wealthiest of the wealthy. And some of the amenities in these suites, we're talking a faux fireplace, a card table, plush sofas and chairs, and even private writing desks. That way, if you wanted to write a letter, you didn't have to go over to the writing room with the pores. However, there was another style of first class staterooms, and this was the first class alternate staterooms. So they were actually second class staterooms. However, they would be reserved for first class passengers if there was an overflow of those ones. So these were the same as second class staterooms, with the exception that they had their own private heaters and they were usually carpeted. And during Titanic's first and, let's just be honest, only voyage, a number of these rooms were occupied by first class passengers, and they said they were great. But I'll get into second class amenities in a little bit. We're on the first class still. So those are the staterooms. And these staterooms were mostly on the upper levels of the ship and the center of the ship, where you would feel the less vibration and movement from the engines and the waves and stuff. Now, a lot of people get this idea that it was more like a cake where you had first class at the top, second class in the middle, and third class at the bottom. Well, it was nothing like that. First class amenities stretched all the way down to G deck, which was the bottom deck above the waterline, before you get down to the engine rooms and stuff. And it was on G deck where the squash court was. Now there's not a whole lot that can be said about the squash court. It was a squash court. Have you ever been to a Y? A squash court's a squash court. What can I say? But it was a first class amenity and it was all the way down there on G deck. And then on the deck above that, F deck, that was where the swimming pool was. Now the bottom of the swimming pool actually extended down into G deck, but that's where the swimming pool was, and it was just kind of off of the Turkish bath complex, which was down there, which was also a very opulent first class amenity. So the idea that the third class passengers were the only ones in the bowels of the ship along with the crew kind of goes out the water when you realize that first class was way down on G deck. Now the staterooms were higher up, but the amenities were mostly in the lower decks of the ship. But the bath complex and the pool, they were lavishly decorated. They were considered the best of the best at the time. The pool was a heated swimming pool, for Christ's sake, which I guess being right above Boiler Room 5 kind of helps with that. Heat rises. But this was the epitome of opulence and luxury. Ain't no other ships at this time have heated swimming pools and opulent Turkish baths except for the sister ship, the Olympic. But back up to the top of the ship, that's where we get into the really insanely lavish decorated stuff. So let's head up to the gymnasium. So the first class gymnasium was just aft of the forward grand staircase, along the starboard side of the boat deck. It was a brightly lit room with white painted oak panels and a tile floor, so it was emphasizing cleanliness, which was a big thing during Victorian and Edwardian times. And it contained all of the state-of-the-art exercising equipment you would find in 1912. It had 2 mechanical camels, a mechanical horse, a rowing machine, a punching bag, a weightlifting machine, mechanical bicycles, those bowling pins that they used to do whatever they did with. And it had a permanent physical educator, or what we would call today, a personal trainer on staff named T.W. McCauley, who assisted passengers in using the devices. Kind of like how the squash court had its own full-time instructor on staff. His name was Mr. Frederick Wright, and he actually died during the sinking of the ship. But I'll get into the crew later. It's 30 minutes in. We haven't even launched the ship yet or completed building it. Furthermore, on C deck, not far from the grand staircase, there was a small barber shop for first class passengers where you could buy souvenirs and get a shave and a haircut for just a shilling. But nothing on this ship was as luxurious as the restaurant. So the a la carte restaurant was exclusive to first class passengers, and it was an imitation of the Ritz restaurant first featured on board the Hamburg America liner SS America in 1905, which proved to be extremely popular, so that's why White Star Line went with this idea. Because where do cruise ships make a lot of money aside from the casino? In those restaurants. Now, this restaurant was the preferred alternative to the main dining saloon and gave passengers the option of enjoying lavish French haute cuisine, which was the style at the time. That was like the trend, the fashion. Everybody wanted French cuisine. It was one of the most luxurious rooms on the ship, and it was decorated in this Louis XVI style. So I imagine it would have been fairly Baroque looking, very gaudy, very gilt. So to give kind of a layout of this room or this restaurant, it could accommodate about 137 diners. Most of the tables were designed for 2 people, so it was to create that intimate, romantic experience. There was French walnut paneling and fluted columns interspersed throughout the room. Along the forward wall, there was a large buffet with a peach marble top, and along the rear wall, there was a raised bandstand for the orchestra, which would play, with buffets on each side offering silver service and cutlery. And what was kind of cool about this place was if you choose to eat at the restaurant exclusively throughout the duration of the trip, you would get a 3 to 5 pound rebate on your ticket at the time of purchase. And that's a lot of money back then. That's almost like a $500 rebate in today's money. But I digress. But back to the restaurant. So this restaurant was designed to create that luxurious, intimate encounter. You want to impress your woman on a date, you take her to a restaurant like this. And in fact, we have an account from a surviving first-class passenger who dined at this restaurant who gives us the following. It was the last word in luxury. The tables were gray with pink roses and white daisies. The stringed orchestra played music from Puccini and Tchaikovsky. The food was superb: caviar, lobster, quail from Egypt, plovers, eggs, and hothouse grapes and fresh peaches. So this was like the place to be if you wanted to be there with the highest of high society. The epitome of luxury and wealth and decadence and power. This was the place to be. Now, despite it being on this ship, the guy who ran the restaurant, a man named Luigi Gotti, and his staff, they weren't White Star staff, nor were they part of the regular crew. They were restaurateurs, so they were basically free to do whatever they wanted. Now, personally, I don't know if that counts them amongst the numbered of crew or not, but I assume, given that we know exactly who was on the ship and who wasn't for the most part, they were counted as crew members in those final tally numbers after the disaster. Now, let's say you're a first-class passenger and you decide you don't want to eat in the restaurant. Well, you would end up eating in the massive dining saloon. Now, the first-class dining saloon was 1,000 square meters. It was the largest room on board of any ship in 1912, and it could accommodate up to 554 passengers. It contained tables ranging from 2-seaters up to 12, and it contained 2 elaborately carved oak buffet stations at both the forward and aft end of the room. And from what I've seen, it's kind of like a dining hall or a cafeteria. There are specific designated times for like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you're pretty much seated according to like a designated seating chart that they figure out before you even board. This space would also be reserved for Sunday morning Anglican church services. And while a little more basic than the a la carte restaurant, it was still pretty opulent by the standards of the day. Other places for first-class passengers to get a snack or a bite to eat were the Veranda Cafe, which was this Parisian-style sidewalk cafe where a person could enjoy a nice tea, or if they were in the smoking section, a smoke. And then the Cafe Parisian, which was another little restaurant on the ship, it could accommodate up to 68 passengers, which had its own little buffet and China service. It was open only from like 8 to 11 a.m., and it was popular amongst younger adults on board. And other accommodations for first-class passengers were a large reception room, the lounge, a smoking room, a reading and writing room, the promenade deck, and the infamous grand staircase. Now, anybody who's ever even heard the word Titanic knows about the damn grand staircase. Hell, this staircase alone has an entire Wikipedia article about it. It's like the most popular area of the ship, even though it was just a staircase. But it was designed to be like an opulent entrance hall with this beautiful wrought iron and glass dome which let in all this natural sunlight. Now, there are no known photographs of Titanic's grand staircase. However, it is said to have been identical to Olympic's grand staircase. So the photos and the image we get in our head are actually of the Olympic. However, it's basically the same. So let's get into it. The grand staircase was located in the forward part of the ship, and it was the main connection between the decks for first-class passengers and the point of entry to numerous public rooms. And it descends 7 levels from the boat deck all the way down to E deck. However, if you didn't want to walk all the way down those stairs to E deck, you could just go forward of the staircase and turn a corner, and there were 3 first-class elevators that connected alongside the staircase that could take you down to E deck or wherever you needed to go. And personally, I think the elevators are more fascinating than the staircase simply because it's 1912. Now, elevators aren't a completely new technology at this time, but they're fairly new technology. And seeing an elevator on a ship in 1912, to me, that would seem like a big deal. But they're not as glamorous as the staircase, so let's move on. So we're going to go down the grand staircase deck by deck, because why not? So up at the boat deck, that part of it functioned as an interior balcony which looked down on A deck below. And up on this deck, you could go outside to the boat deck and you can go into the gymnasium, which was right next door. And on this deck, branching from either side of the staircase, were the Marconi room and the officers' quarters. They were down these little corridors. And of course, below that is A deck, and that's where the reading and writing room and the lounge are. On this deck, there were 2 entry vestibules which connected to the promenade deck, and 2 corridors forward of the stairwell access the A deck first class staterooms. And this is where you get that iconic image of the sweeping staircase and the wrought iron and glass dome with its large central crystal and gilt chandelier. And then you see the iconic solid Irish oak staircase with each banister containing elaborate wrought iron grills with ormolu swags in the Louis XIV style. These 20 feet wide staircases were surrounded with entrance halls which were appointed in the same polished oak paneling carved in neoclassical William and Mary style. The panels of the newel posts were carved with high relief garlands, each one a unique design and topped with pineapple fennels. The floors were laid with cream-colored linoleum tiles interspersed with black medallions. Armchairs and sofas upholstered in blue were provided just off the staircases, and potted plums in raised holders dotted each level. And back up on the boat deck, I almost forgot, there was an upright piano which allowed the orchestra to do impromptu concerts on the grand staircase itself. And on the central landing of A deck staircase was a clock flanked by 2 carved allegorical figures symbolizing honor and glory, crowning time. And finally, a bronze cherub sculpture holding an illuminated torch graced the central newel post at the base of this staircase. And that's all A deck and the boat deck. It's like a 2-story kind of area. And if that description sounds like I read it from a script, yes, I read it from my script. Sometimes accounts or descriptions written by other people are a lot better than anything I can come up with. Now, this look that you would see up here at the top, that flowed all the way down to E deck. Now, the further down you got, the more basic it looked. And on those lower levels, instead of clocks, there were paintings on the wall. But you get the same idea all the way down. So B deck was mostly where the first class passengers were housed. That's where their staterooms were. This also, right off of the grand staircase, was where the 2 millionaire suites were. Then down on C deck, that's where a lot of the pursers and inquiry offices were, followed by more long hallways of first class staterooms. On D deck, that was where you entered the first class dining room and some of the first class cabins that were a little more forward towards the bow. Then down on E deck, you came down the stairway there. The stairs actually kind of narrowed and lost the curve, and it was just first class staterooms. And this is basically where the grand staircase terminates down here on E deck. Now there was a single little staircase, a more modest one, that took you down to F deck to the Turkish baths and the pool and stuff, but it was nowhere near as elaborate or gaudy as what you just descended down. And that long-winded tirade basically sums up the first class amenities. They're essentially the entire center portion of the ship. And in fact, the largest part of the ship was dedicated to first class amenities. The ship could accommodate up to 833 passengers in first class. And if there was an overflow of that, like there was on the maiden voyage, certain second class rooms, which were further towards the stern, were used as what was called first class alternate rooms. These were literally second class rooms with a few special perks. Now, the second class amenities and the passengers on the ship is largely overshadowed in discussions of Titanic, and that is for a number of reasons. For one, it was the smallest dedicated area for passengers. The second class areas could only accommodate up to 614 passengers, and it was almost entirely concentrated in the stern of the ship. And with second class being so small, and a lot of these rooms being alternate first class rooms, they actually shared the kitchen and galley with first class. Now, the second class passengers, they did have their own dining room towards the stern of the ship, and it wasn't too bad. It wasn't like a huge downgrade from the first class dining saloon, and it was actually on the same deck as the first class dining saloon, D deck. Now, it was about half the size of its first class counterpart, but that makes sense because it's used to accommodate fewer passengers, and it could accommodate up to about 394 people in one sitting. However, there were a few noticeable differences. Instead of the little tables that were in the first class dining saloon, these had like long rows of tables, so it was more of like a cafeteria setting. But that being said, the whole room was still paneled in beautiful oak and had mahogany swivel chairs. covered in red leather. It too, just like the first class dining saloon, had an upright Steinway and Sons piano in there for like Sunday church services. And to be honest, it was known to be equivalent to first class accommodations on other ships of the time. And it's the same with the staterooms and the smoking room and the barber shop and even the library, which was way up on C deck. And the staterooms were great. They were the equivalent to first class staterooms on other ships. They featured white painted oak paneling, mahogany furniture, sofas, and even wash basins. However, the second class facilities didn't have their own bathrooms. There were usually like public bathrooms around the second class area. But as I said, second class did contain and was always expected to contain the least amount of passengers. So in economic terms, it makes sense just to have some general public bathrooms. But we get the general idea. So then we get into third class accommodations. Now, third class accommodations were kind of separated at the bow and the stern, with the dining areas being in the middle. So at the stern, those staterooms ran all the way from the poop deck down to F deck, and they were all staterooms pretty much. And these rooms were reserved for families or single women. The single men who were in third class, their cabins were actually in the bow of the ship, right behind the crew members' cabins, and they pretty much took up that whole space. All in all, there were 84 total cabins for the third class passengers. However, some of these cabins could accommodate up to 10 people. And for the time, they were very nice because typically, if you were a third class or what we call a steerage passenger, you were basically housed in a big dormitory in like the crappiest parts of the ship. But White Star Line decided to break away from that in order to capture the increasing immigrant market, and they offered third-class passengers their own staterooms. That's why when you hear the word steerage, it doesn't really apply to Titanic because of this distinction. But these third-class cabins, they weren't terrible by any means. They were considered actually very luxurious for third class. They were very spacious and open. They were bright and airy. They were paneled in white painted pine with salmon peak colored linoleum floors. They had mattresses with, White Star Line bedding. These rooms too even had private wash basins and were considered very comfortable. Now, like second class, they didn't have their own bathrooms, so the third class passengers shared these two like really big bathroom facilities, public baths basically. And all in all, they could accommodate up to 1,100 third class passengers. Now, that being said, there weren't a whole lot of amenities or public spaces for third class passengers. There was only really 4 big public spaces in which they could congregate in. So let's start with the dining saloon. The dining saloon was kind of midship down on F deck, and it was right off the third class kitchen. Now, it was actually 2 rooms because it was separated by a bulkhead, and they still kept that same kind of segregation. The men would sit in the forward kind of room, and the women and families would sit towards the rear. And this was mostly just probably due to that old puritanical mindset of the time. We don't want these single men mixing with these single ladies. No, that can't happen. Especially amongst the lower classes because they don't know any better and they need to be chaperoned at all times. But it could accommodate up to 473 people. Now, parts of this room were paneled in white pine, and other parts of the room, depending where you were at, it was basically painted in this bright white enamel with like advertisements for White Star Line ships. It was open, airy, there were portholes so it let the natural light in. They had the same kind of long table setup but with nice oak chairs. And the food, while not as glamorous as something you would find up in first class or in the Veranda Cafe, it was still worth it. It was great food. The equivalent of something that you would find at any great restaurant today. Remember, this is a business. They want to sell these people a good experience. That way, when even these third class passengers get to their destination, they can write home to their families, yeah, dude, if you're going to take a trip to America, dude, go White Star Line, get on the Titanic. Because word of mouth is how you grow a customer base. I don't care what industry you're in. So that was kind of in the central part of the ship. So back up under the poop deck, just right there at the stern, There were two other gathering spaces for third class passengers. There was the men's third class smoking room, which had a bar and card tables and blah blah blah. And there was the rear general room. And to be honest, pictures of this room that I've seen kind of reminds me of like an airport or a bus station or something. So it was basically like a liminal space, a place where you can just go to hang out. There were like benches and seating areas and like tables where you could write letters and whatever. You could sit there and read the newspaper or a book. You could interact with other passengers. This room too had its own piano, and people could like grab their instruments and have impromptu parties. There was actually a party on the night of the sinking in this room, and you could do this stuff up to about 10 p.m. when they kind of closed it down for the night. And then the fourth kind of common room on the ship or recreation area was the third class open space. This was at the bow on D deck, and this served kind of the same purpose as the general room, but there was more of an entertainment or party atmosphere. So it had a bar and water fountains, and you could dance in there. People could play games and socialize, and it was just basically a big party room, for lack of a better term. Of course, they weren't all confined to these areas. Up on the poop deck, that was considered the third class promenade. So basically the whole stern area was pretty much the third class's domain. So the idea that they were down in the bowels of the ship, that's just entirely wrong. Many of the third class passengers easily made it up to the stern because that's where they were already at during the sinking, but we'll get to that later. But there we go. I just spent, I don't know, a half hour just giving a grand tour of the ship. It was a floating Ritz hotel. It was the pinnacle of luxury. It was mankind's statement to domination of the waters. And after almost 3 years of building and fitting out and a few renovations to make it even more opulent and luxurious, it was finally ready for its sea trials. Now, the sea trials were carried out in Belfast Lough and in the open waters of the Irish Sea. And this was a series of tests considering how the ship would handle under certain conditions, because it basically had to be, for lack of a better term, certified as passenger safe and seaworthy. So one of the tests was to bring the ship up to maximum speed, which was 21 knots or 24 miles per hour or 39 kilometers an hour for you commies out there. And while at full speed, it was supposed to come to what is called a crash stop. So it's like a sudden reversal of the engines while going full speed. And it passed this test along with all its other tests on maneuverability and handling and whatnot. And it was certified as good to go. And 8 days later, we get to the launch of the maiden voyage. So it's about freaking time, right? 51 minutes in. But no one said this would be a short episode. At this rate, it might go as long as the actual 1997 film. But if you've stuck with me this long, then you are truly awesome. And for those who dipped out after 5 minutes, well, screw you guys, I didn't like you anyway. I guess you're not really fans of the mysterious, or I don't know, fans of awesome boat facts. So the big day, the maiden voyage, Wednesday, 10 April 1912. So Titanic is ready to take off. So it has about 885 crew members, most of whom were casual workers and not able seamen, so they didn't have a lot of experience. We'll get into this later. And the ship would be captained by White Star Line's most senior captain, a man named Edward Smith, who had just served on the Olympic, which had launched back in 1911. And this was supposed to be his last post, his big hurrah retirement voyage. The crew were made up of 66 deck crew, so they were like boatswains and stuff, who were mostly abled seamen, 325 engine crew, and then 494 which were known as victiculating, so they were like the bakers and the fishmongerers and the stewards. Out of this, it was 97% male, only 23 of the crew members were women. And then we get to the passengers. So the passengers numbered approximately 1,317. And we say approximately, we don't know exact numbers because some people didn't make it onto the ship. Some people actually canceled their trips for a number of reasons. But it is generally said that there were 324 people in first class, 284 people in second class, and 709 in third class during the maiden voyage. Of these, 869 or 66% were male, and 447 or 34% were female. Of these, 107 were children, and most of the children were third class passengers, obviously. Now, Titanic was actually very under capacity when it launched on its maiden voyage, and this was due to a coal strike, which caused a disruption to shipping schedules in 1912. Remember, all these ships are powered by coal. And the only reason why the Titanic was actually to set sail on this day was because a few days before Titanic was set to sail, the coal strike finally ended, and coal was actually transferred from other vessels that were tied up at Southampton in order for Titanic to make its maiden voyage. So it goes to show that if the coal strike had ended later in the season, we would have never had this disaster in the first place. But I digress. So on 10 April 1912 at 9:30 a.m., the passengers began arriving on the ship at Southampton. And even this was broken up by class, so the large number of third class passengers meant that they were allowed to board first. And upon their boarding, they were inspected for ailments and physical impairments, which might lead to them being refused entry to the United States. So these are things like diseases. And this is due to the strict nature of America's immigration policy at the time. Now, to be honest, a lot of that was built upon racism back then, but keeping out infectious diseases was a big thing, especially foreign diseases that we had no immunities to. So on these White Star ships, as well as other ships, there were, for the steerage passengers, inspectors who would inspect these people, and anybody who didn't pass didn't get to ride, because the last thing White Star wanted to do was waste time and money ferrying this person back across the Atlantic because they couldn't enter the United States. So at Southampton, they pick up 920 total passengers. 494 were in third class, 247 were in second class, and 179 were in first. And the second and first class passengers, they were getting the luxury service. They were being escorted to their rooms, or bags were being carried for them. The stewards were like, "Welcome aboard, what can I do for you today? This is where this amenity is, this is where this is." And the first class passengers, of course, got the opulent treatment. I mean, they spent the most amount of money to be on this ship, so they were personally greeted by the captain himself, which I guess is considered a big deal. I know in modern cruises, things like dining at the captain's table is supposed to be a big deal, but I don't really see the appeal to it. At the end of the day, he's just a guy doing a job, and it seems pretty rude to distract him from that job, but I guess it's part of the captain's duties. So the maiden voyage finally launches at noon, right on time, and as soon as it launches, a disaster is narrowly avoided. So for context, in the harbor with the Titanic were two moored ships, the Oceanic and the SS City of New York. However, the massive displacement of waters by the Titanic as it went by the mooring lines of these other ships caused them to be lifted by this huge bulge of water and drop down into a trough. Now, the mooring cables of the New York couldn't take that strain, and they actually snapped. And this caused the stern of the New York to swing around and almost hit the Titanic, which would have been a huge, devastating accident. Now, thinking quickly, Captain Smith actually does a smart thing here. He orders that the engines be put full astern, and this avoids the collision by 1.2 meters or 4 feet. So this was close. This was very close. However, luckily there was a tugboat in the area called the Vulcan, and it was able to get the New York under control. And although it delayed everything by about an hour, Titanic was able to safely depart. Now, while in hindsight it seems obvious that this massive ship would have that kind of water displacement and cause these problems in a harbor, at the time these people really didn't have much of a clue as to how it was going to affect other ships moored in the harbor, for example. This is a little bit of man's hubris at play, and we all know how hubris comes back to bite us, but I digress. Now, witnesses to this incident stated that this was a bad omen, and there was kind of this general idea that maybe the ship was cursed. And this idea of a curse gets attached to the Titanic for multiple reasons, especially during the building phase. So during the building phase, there was this rumor circulating around that one of the deaths involved in building the Titanic actually involved a man who became trapped within the double hull of the ship and was sealed up in there and subsequently died. There was also this general belief that since White Star Lines didn't christen their ship with that iconic smashing the bottle of champagne against the hull, that it meant that Titanic would be a cursed ship. Now, this is actually a very old tradition that goes back to the Vikings. So the Vikings would pour drops of blood from a sacrificed animal on the ship's bow for good luck. That eventually evolves into the tradition of smashing a bottle of wine or smashing a bottle of champagne during the initial launching of a ship in order to garner good luck or good fortune. Now, White Star Line didn't do this on their ships. I don't really know the reason why. Maybe it was because they didn't believe in this old superstition, but that did lead people to eventually think that maybe that had something to do with the tragedy, especially concerning that during the launching of the ship, one person had actually died when some timbers fell and crushed him. So it's fair to say that due to these rumors, these superstitions, the ship could have been cursed from the very beginning. But despite that near disaster, Titanic makes it safely through the complex tides and channels of Southampton water and heads out into the English Channel for the first leg of its journey, and it headed for the French port of Cherbourg. So Cherbourg lacked docking facilities for a ship of this size, so these little smaller ships known as tenders would come out and ferry more passengers aboard. It would also ferry some passengers off because some passengers had only booked a cross-channel kind of excursion. So 4 hours after launch, Titanic arrives at Cherbourg and it takes on 274 additional passengers. 142 in first class, 30 in second class, and 102 in third class. The 24 passengers who had only booked the cross-channel passage, this is where they disembark. This whole process takes about 90 minutes, and then at 8 p.m. Titanic weighs anchor and it leaves for Queenstown. And we have a weather report from this day. It states that the conditions were cold and windy, but mostly good. Now we have to remember this is early April. It's the tail end of winter. We haven't quite gotten into spring yet, so most of the weather conditions are going to be cold. This is why there's an abundance of ice in the sea at this point. So the Titanic sets out on the second leg of its journey and it's heading to Cork Harbour on the south coast of Ireland. And from the passenger's perspective, nothing really of note happens. So at 11:30 a.m. on Thursday, 11 April, Titanic arrives at Cork Harbour. And just as before, at Cherbourg in France, the ship takes on more passengers, and passengers who have only booked a ticket to here disembark. So the disembarking ones here were 7 passengers. And 123 board Titanic here at this harbor, Cork Harbour, also known as Queenstown, of which 3 were first class, 7 were second class, and 113 were third class. Now, there was one unofficial departure that day. A crew member, a stoker named John Coffey, who was a native to this area, he decides for whatever reason to jump ship, probably because working as a stoker on the Titanic was a bullshit job. So he hides under a bunch of mail bags that were being transported to shore, and he essentially jumps ship. So after all this, Titanic weighs anchor one last time at 1:30 p.m. and departs for the final leg of its journey across the Atlantic. So from here, the idea is we're going to steam ahead and reach New York, Pier 59 on 17 April. It's going to be open waters and smooth sailing from now on. And at the time, the passengers are doing typical cruise ship passenger stuff. First class people are hanging out in the smoking room, going to the restaurants, hanging out in the gym, playing squash. The second-class passengers are doing much of the same aside from the restaurants and hanging out at the squash court. And third-class passengers, they're partying in these common rooms and dreaming about their new lives that they're going to start in America. Just like being on a modern cruise ship, except there's no casino and the class system is kind of dead. However, the crew were dealing with their own little debacles and random stuff. So approximately 10 days before the initial departure, a fire had broken out in the forwardmost coal bunker. This was the one that supplied coal to boiler rooms 5 and 6. Now, this initially wasn't considered much of a big deal. Spontaneous combustion of coal would happen frequently on these steamships. And it wouldn't really burn like a fire like we would think about it. It would just kind of smolder. Now, this fire was still burning for several days during the cruise. However, the passengers were made unaware. Now, the only way to extinguish these fires was to basically control the burn. So the coal that wasn't burning, they would remove and place in another bunker. And the coal that was burning, they just shove down and feed into the furnaces because you're going to burn it anyway in the furnaces, so why not? And the fire had finally been extinguished by 14 April. However, the crew were investigating whether this fire had damaged the ship. And crew members would investigate this all the way up until the second the iceberg hit the ship, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So while that is going on, the radio room is receiving an increasing series of warnings from other ships in the area of drifting ice and to be cautious. Now, even in the days before departure, Edward Smith and his crew knew about the situation of the drift ice field. It was more southerly than it had been in previous years, and it was along this major shipping route. And even during the voyage, Titanic received several Marconigrams as well as a Morse lamp message warning of this ice field. So the first warning came on 12 April at 1746 from the French ship La Touraine, and it stated that it had sighted thick field ice, and it was receiving ice warnings from another ship in the area known as the Paris as well, which had seen field ice and 2 large icebergs. Now on 13 April, Titanic encountered a steamer known as the Rappahannock, which was heading east, and it's believed that they communicated or tried to communicate with Titanic by use of a Morse lamp of heavy ice in the area. Now on April 14th, the day of the disaster, they received several ice warnings. So at 9:12, the Carolina radioed the Titanic that westbound steamers had reported icebergs, growlers, smaller pieces of ice, and a field of ice along the 42nd parallel, to which Captain Smith simply responded, "Thanks." Later that morning at 11:47, the ship Nordam informed about an area north of the 42nd parallel with a simple message, "Much ice reported," to which Captain Smith then again just sends back the message, "Thanks." However, for some reason, he must have taken this one more seriously because he shows the Marconigram to Second Officer Charles Lightoller and had him hang it up in the chart room. Later at 13:49, there was a report from the German steamer America that it had passed 2 large icebergs. Now, the operators had passed this along, however, it was not known whether or not this was passed on to the bridge crew. Then at 13:54, Titanic receives a Marconigram from the Baltic, which reports that there were several icebergs and extensive drift fields throughout the day. This was another one that was transferred up to Captain Smith. However, it wasn't known if all the other officers on board was aware of this one. Then around 1830, the Californian observed 3 large icebergs 5 miles south of her. She reported this, giving her own position. However, the Titanic didn't hear this message until 1937 because the radio equipment had been switched off at this time, and they heard it on, I guess, a rebroadcast when they were sending it to another ship. However, this message was also sent up to the bridge. Then at 21:40, a message comes from the ship Masaba, and it defined an area with heavy pack ice, a great number of large icebergs, and an ice field. Now, there was confirmation that Titanic did receive this message, however, it was never relayed to Captain Smith. And then the last radio transmission to Titanic came from the Californian's radio operator at 22:55, and it was a statement that the Californian had stopped because it was surrounded by ice. However, it's believed that this one wasn't relayed either. Now, at the time, the radio room wasn't really for relaying messages to the bridge and the captain or ice warnings or anything. The point of the radio room was really for passenger use to receive and send Marconigrams. So the radio operators at the time are more concerned with getting passenger messages out to their friends and family as opposed to getting these messages to the crew. Because remember, these guys are just radio operators. They're hired by this Marconigram company in order to provide a luxury service to their passengers. They didn't know how to evaluate things like ice warnings or other messages related to navigation. In their minds, their main concern regarding crew messages was whether or not it was directly addressed to the captain. Then they would send it along. Other times they would send other stuff up to the bridge, but there was no real formal procedure for relaying these messages, so it's generally believed that no one in the ship's command saw all the ice warnings. And even amongst the surviving officers, a lot of them would say, no, I didn't know about that ice warning, or I didn't know about this ice warning. And it's believed that the captain only knew about maybe 2 or 3 of them, so there wasn't that sense of danger. And even though ice was known to be dangerous, in the past, other ships and steamers had hit icebergs head on and were known to survive. And given the fact that Titanic was built around this idea of safety first, the thought that a drifting iceberg was going to take out this massive luxury ship was considered ludicrous. But that doesn't mean that they just ignored it and threw all caution to the wind. On the night of the disaster, it's said that Captain Smith assumed that an iceberg would be discovered. However, it would be discovered in time that they could readjust and miss it. It was a crisp, clear night with no cloudiness, and they believed that an iceberg could be seen within 1 to 3 nautical miles, so that'd be plenty of time to avoid it. And according to surviving second officer Charles Lightoller, he and Smith believed that an iceberg that night was visible for up to 4 nautical miles, and Smith had said that at the slightest sign of haze, the ships should proceed very slowly, and the lookouts up in the crow's nest were instructed to pay particular attention to ice on this night. However, unfortunately, disaster would strike because after 4 days of smooth sailing, on Sunday, 14 April at 23:40, that's board time of the Titanic, disaster would strike. So at this time, 2 men were up in the crow's nest and they were on these 2-hour shifts because it was freaking cold up there. And neither one of them had binoculars. The binoculars were actually not relegated for this task. They were locked away in a locker somewhere. So with their naked eye in pitch blackness at about 1,500 feet or 900 meters away, they spot this huge kind of shadow just kind of rising out of the water. Frederick Fleet, one of the guys in the crow's nest, immediately sounds the bell in order to signal that he sees something straight ahead in front of the ship. He gets on the telephone, which is up there in the crow's nest, and he immediately informs the bridge, iceberg straight ahead. At this moment, First Officer William Murdoch orders the ship to be steered around the iceberg and the engines reversed. However, it was too late. Only 40 seconds after spotting the iceberg and sounding the warning call, the Titanic collided with the iceberg. There just wasn't enough time to steer this massive ship completely out of the path of this iceberg. The collision with the iceberg creates a series of dents and holes below the waterline, and these big iron plates, they just start to buckle and separate, which allowed water to just rush in. And it's rushing into the bow at an enormous speed. It's rushing in faster than the pumps can pump it out. Now, Titanic was designed to sustain damage if up to 4 of its watertight compartments were filled. However, in the collision, 5 of the 16 watertight compartments were heavily breached, and a 6th compartment, back where boiler room 5 was slightly breached. This was too many breached compartments for the ship to stay afloat. and at this point the ship begins to sink, bow first. Now, initially up in first class and even parts of second class, they didn't even notice. They heard like a dull thud because this is all happening below the waterline where the crew is mostly working. Even in third class, they would have felt some shaking because, that's the least desirable parts of the ship, and that third class area in the upper parts of the bow, they would have felt a massive impact. But at this time, within the first few minutes, especially amongst the passengers, it's not really clear what happened. They haven't even sounded an emergency yet. So at this point, after 7 seconds of scraping along the side of this iceberg, the ship is now filling with water, and it takes up to 5 minutes for the ship to finally stop. Now, while this is going on, the mailroom starts flooding. It's one of the first rooms on the ship to flood. And for context, this was a very large room, so the Titanic had basically a floating post office on it with 5 postal workers. This was located at the bow of the ship, down on F and G decks. So up on F deck, you had like the typical looking post office, the sorting room where they would sit and sort letters and stuff all day. And below that, you had the actual mail room where like the bags of mail would be sitting until they go upstairs to be sorted. So during the time when the ship does strike the iceberg, one of the postal workers, a man named Oscar Woody, is actually celebrating his 44th birthday with the rest of the other 4 guys in the post office. They're doing the whole birthday thing. They're having some drinks. They're saying for he's a jolly good fellow, blah, blah, blah. It's a party. Then they scrape by the iceberg and they immediately hear the sound of water rushing in below where they're at. So upon realizing that, hey, the mailroom is flooding, they run down there because there's 200 sacks of registered mail that they are essentially responsible for. So they're down there and they're hauling these mail bags up to the deck above. However, it's going very slowly, so they grab some stewards and they force them to help them move this mail. Now, you're probably wondering, why is this such a big deal? It's just mail. Well, in the United States and the UK, mail is something that's taken extremely seriously. It's federally regulated in both nations, and people who work in the postal services, they take their jobs very seriously. So back to the story, they instantly jump into action and they go downstairs to try to save as much mail as possible. However, the room is flooding too fast, and they do this right up until the very end. One of the stewards, who was the last man to see these men alive, later recalled, "I urged them to leave their work. They shook their heads and continued at their work. It might have been an inrush of water later that cut off their escape, or it may have been the explosion. I saw them no more." These men were believed to be amongst the first men to die aboard the Titanic that night, and all 5 of them died trying to save the mail. And for that, they were regarded as heroes. They epitomized the idea of being true to your duty up to the very end, being steadfast in peril. And they're just one story amongst many other crew members who stood at their stations and did their job to the very end. So while the mailroom's flooding, there's other flooding going on too. So cargo holds 1, 2, and 3, boiler room 6, and boiler room 5 are all flooding in the immediate aftermath of the Titanic hitting this iceberg. Now, this area was also where that fire in the coal bunkers was taking place. And the day before, they finally get the fire under control, and even on the night at the time when the iceberg hits, there's 2 men and they're inspecting this area. And this fire bunker was right up against the hull of the ship. And 2 of these guys would later state in a testimony that they noticed deformations in the steel in the bulkhead after they had extinguished this fire. One leading fireman named Charles Hendrickson said, and quote, "You could see where it had been red hot. All the paint and everything was off. It was dented a bit. Yes, warped." End quote. Another leading fireman who survived, his name was Frederick Barrett. He says in a deposition, "It was damaged from the bottom. The bottom of the watertight compartment was dinged aft and the other part was dinged forward." And there's long been speculation that these damaged areas of the ships due to this fire could have resulted in Titanic sinking faster. And this has been a long leading hypothesis. Did the fire contribute to the sinking or accelerate the sinking? I personally think it did, but as far as we know, the jury's still kind of out on the whole thing. Now, Frederick Barrett and the second engineering officer, a man named John Henry Hexeth, they were both in boiler room number 6 inspecting the coal bunker at this time when the ice was scraping down the side of the Titanic. And the pair were actually able to escape through the connecting tunnel to number 5 boiler room, and they managed to close the bulkhead doors behind them. So at this time, it's been about 5 minutes and the ship has finally come to a stop and it's just kind of drifting. And these compartments are filling up with water fast. And while all this chaos is going on in these lower decks, up in the upper decks, like in the first class dining room, for example, the stewards basically stated that they just felt a shudder or a bump. Some said that they thought that the ship may had shed a propeller, and many passengers corroborated this. They said that they felt a bump or a shudder, but no one was really alarmed, mostly because they were ignorant as to what had happened. Now, Captain Smith, he had retired to his cabin earlier. However, he felt the collision in his cabin. So Captain Smith, he immediately goes to the bridge to find out what's going on. He summons Thomas Andrews, who was essentially the ship's designer, who was on board with a team of engineers who were observing the ship's first passenger voyage. At this time, just a few minutes after the collision, the ship was already listing 5 degrees starboard and was 2 degrees down by the head. It's quickly deduced that the ship is sinking. So Smith and Andrews, they go down below deck and they find that the forward cargo holds, the mailroom, and the squash court were all flooded, which I guess it also means the pool and the Turkish baths were flooded at this time too, because they were all kind of next to each other, but I digress. Boiler room 6 was already filled up to a depth of 14 feet or 4.3 meters, and water was spilling over into boiler room 5. And there were crewmen down here who were furiously trying to keep these pumps running to get this seawater out of the ship. However, it's a fruitless battle because Titanic is filling up at a total of 7 long tons per second. Let me repeat that. That is 7 tons of water per second. That is a massive amount of water, and it was 15 times faster than the pumps could pump it out. However, these crewmen, their whole mindset was, we gotta try. Now, at this time, it's an extremely dangerous situation for the ship and the crew. So the boilers, they were still filled with hot, high-pressure steam, and there was a substantial risk that they would explode if they came into contact with the cold seawater. So the stokers and firemen, they immediately go into action. They were ordered to reduce the fires and vent the boilers, which sent great quantities of steam up the funnel venting pipes. By the time they finish their work, they're already waist deep in freezing water. And a lot of these crewmen and engineers above this ship, they will man these stations for as long as possible in order to save as many lives as possible, a lot of them sacrificing themselves in the effort. So at 5 minutes after midnight, Captain Smith orders the ship's lifeboats to be uncovered and the passengers mustered. And unfortunately, this all turns out to be somewhat of a clusterfuck, because a lot of the crew weren't really able seamen. They were casual workers. They were inexperienced. And most importantly, they're not really communicating with each other all that well. So immediately upon getting this order, the stewards are going door to door through all the staterooms, telling the passengers who are still asleep, get up, get your life belts on, and get to the top decks. And even in this, the whole class system kind of played a large role. So the stewards who were responsible for their section of staterooms amongst their class kind of only dealt with those said passengers. So for example, the stewards who were dealing with the first and even second class passengers, they weren't dealing with so many passengers. However, the stewards who were dealing with third class passengers had to deal with very large groups of people. And despite all this, nobody was being locked behind gates in the bowels of the ship. Now, while there were gates that were open and closed for like certain sections of the ships, nobody was locked below deck and left to their fates. And if you recall, the whole stern of the ship was basically third class accommodations, so it was very easy for them to get up to the third class promenade, which was basically the entirety of the poop deck. So these stewards are going around, they're, throwing open doors and saying, get your life belts on and get up on the boat deck now. And a lot of the passengers are just confused. They're like, why? A lot of them are just completely oblivious to what happened, and they don't think that there's any signs of danger. Now, at this time, passengers weren't told that the ship was sinking because they didn't want to incite a panic. And a lot of passengers were reluctant to even come out onto the boat deck because they didn't think anything was going on, and they preferred to stay in the warmth of the ship rather than go out on that freezing cold deck. So they were reluctant to do anything. They were like, screw you. And even at 15 minutes after midnight, when they were informing the passengers to put their life vests on, a lot of the passengers just took it as a joke. Some of the passengers were out over on the foredeck just kicking around the ice chunks in an impromptu game of football. However, a lot of people would say that it was very difficult to hear anything on the boat deck at this time because of the high pressure steam being vented from the boilers. It was creating this deafening booming sound. It was described as like a locomotive or several locomotives, and it got to the point where the crew members were communicating using hand signals because nobody could hear anything. So while these people are getting mustered up onto the boat deck and the crew is fighting frantically to keep the ship afloat, Andrews is informing the captain that the first 5 compartments were flooded. This is about 45 minutes after the collision, and by then at least 13,700 tons of water had entered the ship. And it's around this time when Andrews accurately predicts that the ship will not stay afloat no longer than 2 hours. Now, the water flooding the ship wasn't rushing in at a constant pace, nor was it being evenly distributed. There was kind of this asymmetrical flooding of the starboard side. And then about an hour after the flooding initially started, the water poured down a passageway at the bottom of the ship, and when that was fully flooded, the list actually corrected itself. Of course, then that side starts to flood asymmetrically as well. But it's around this time, about an hour into the sinking, when the ship kind of rights itself, and then the sinking goes much slower and more gradually. And this gives a lot of people false hope that everything's going to be fine, and that the ship will stay afloat long enough for them to be rescued. However, as we know, that doesn't happen. So at about 20 minutes after midnight, the order is given to start loading the lifeboats. And this task is taken up by Second Officer Lightoller, who took charge of the boats on the port side, and First Officer Murdoch, he took charge of the lifeboats on the starboard side. So during this, Lightoller and Murdoch took the idea of women and children first very differently. So Lightoller interpreted it as we're only allowing women and children to go down on the boats. So he was lowering lifeboats with empty seats if there were no women or children on the deck at the time in order to get into the boats. While Murdoch instead interpreted it as women and children first and then men if there's no women or children on the deck at the time. And this led to one of several reasons as to why the boats were so underloaded. And we have to remember also at this time a lot of passengers are reluctant to go down into these boats because they don't think there's any real emergency happening. However, a big reason as to why the boats were so underloaded was because neither officer knew how many people could safely be carried in the boats as they were lowered, and both erred on the side of caution. They didn't want to overload the boats and endanger these passengers. And if they had known that a bunch of these boats could have carried up to 68 passengers, it's estimated that an additional 500 people could have been saved that night. However, as I want to reiterate, during these first initial stages of the sinking, it was impossible to get these passengers onto these boats. It was like trying to herd cats away from boxes. And even the officers in charge of the whole operation found it difficult to persuade these passengers to get into the boats. And some of them flatly refused, one of them being the millionaire John Jacob Astor, who literally said, "We are safer here than in that little boat." And spoiler alert, he would not survive the sinking. However, finally at 45 minutes after midnight, midnight, Lifeboat 7 was lowered and it rode away from Titanic with an estimated 28 passengers aboard. It had a carrying capacity of 65. 10 minutes after this, at 55 minutes after midnight, Lifeboat number 6 was lowered on the port side, and it also had 28 passengers. And I guess at this point I'm going to pause and do a long-winded discussion about the lifeboats themselves because it is a note of contention. So Titanic had a total number of 20 lifeboats. Collectively, they could accommodate 1,178 people if they were filled to capacity. So there were 16 wooden boats on davits, which are like little cranes, 8 on either side of the ship. 14 of which were clinker-built wooden lifeboats measuring 30 feet or 9 meters long by 9 feet or 2.77 meters wide by 4 feet deep. Each of these boats had grab lines along the sides of them so passengers in the water could hold onto the boat. And they were filled with a variety of equipment to aid occupants. So they carried 10 oars, boat hooks, 10 imperial gallons or 45 liters of water, a mast, a sail, a compass, a lantern, and watertight metal provision tanks which carried biscuits or hardtack. However, out of fear of theft, this equipment was not kept in the boats, but instead it was locked in boxes on the deck. It was supposed to be transferred over to the boats, and it's believed that almost none of this stuff was transferred over to these boats. And a lot of this equipment went down with the ship. And this just kind of exacerbates more of the inexperience of this crew. Now, a cutter is not too different from a sloop. In America, most of the time they're called sloops, and they're these little agile, really fast ships. They were actually a favorite ship of a lot of pirates, and they can be used as small warships, but I digress. So on Titanic, these two cutters were used as emergency boats. They were kept ready to be launched quickly in the event of an incident requiring a boat in the water, such as a man overboard incident. And they were fully equipped, always uncovered, and ready to go at a moment's notice. Now, they were smaller than the other lifeboats. They were only about 25 feet long and about 7 feet wide, and they had a carrying capacity of about 40. And rounding out the numbers, they had 4 collapsible or Inglehard lifeboats. The best way to describe them effectively would be a boat-shaped unsinkable raft. Their bottoms were made of kapok and cork. Cork is unsinkable for the most part. But the main feature was they had these heavy canvas sides which could be raised up to form a boat. These boats measured 27.5 feet long by 8 feet wide by 3 feet deep, and they had a capacity of about 47 people. Now the collapsibles, they weren't on the davits, the little cranes like all the other boats. The collapsibles were actually stored in 2 locations. 2 of them were stowed up on the boat deck in their collapsed position underneath the cutters. So essentially the cutters can launch, then they can assemble these boats, hook them up to the davits, and drop them down and launch those. Which is actually what happened that night, and it went through quite successfully. However, the other 2 lifeboats were in a very dumb location. They were stowed over the officers' quarters. And neither of these 2 actually made it to the davits to be lowered. One flipped upside down and drifted off, and the other one was kind of just launched right there off the roof of the ship as the bow sank further underwater. So that's the 20 lifeboats we have on the ship. A ship that could carry up to 64. So where are the other 32 lifeboats? Well, it's as I said before, if you listen to that part, Titanic wasn't required to carry that many lifeboats by regulation. Per regulation at the time, it was only required to carry about maybe 10 or 12 boats. So they were over capacity as far as anyone was concerned regulation-wise. Some people will say that this was a cost-cutting measure, but we gotta remember this is the Titanic. They didn't cut costs on anything. And some people say that the reason why the Titanic didn't have all these lifeboats was because they would have spoiled some of the views for the passengers, which is a possibility. However, I think the main reason they didn't have these boats was because these boats weren't meant to keep the entire population of the ship afloat during an emergency. They were simply meant to ferry passengers to nearby ships, and back and forth if an emergency would arise. And 9 times out of 10, these emergencies would happen in major shipping lanes or harbors. Nobody was expecting at the time for the ship to experience an emergency in the open ocean, especially not on its maiden voyage. And that's my little tirade about the lifeboats. Was there technically an inadequate number? Yes. However, it was more due to ineptitude of the crew, a lack of training, a lack of drills, and to be honest, a lack of able seamen, which contributed to these lifeboats being underfilled, which contributed to a greater loss of life. Not to mention the fact that you have these passengers who are just standing there on the deck thinking it's all a big joke, who some outright refuse to even get into the lifeboats in the first place because they didn't think there was any real emergency. They thought that the ship was unsinkable. But back to the sinking. So right around the time the first lifeboats are hitting the water, right before 1 a.m., there's already a problem forming, and it's that they don't have enough able seamen who are capable of captaining these boats, and this is why a lot of men are allowed to board in some cases. And this goes back to the crew. The crew only had 29 able seamen. Now, what's an able seaman? Because I keep mentioning this. An able seaman is a person who carries out the day-to-day operations of a ship. They would be trained specifically when it comes to the lifeboats and operation of the davits, and they would actually be used as captains of the lifeboats if officers weren't present. And this became a case because during this time when they're lowering the lifeboats, 8 of these men were sent down below to E-deck to open up the gangway to allow more passengers to be evacuated, and these men never returned. They were never seen again. And by the time the 8th lifeboat had launched, there were no more able seamen on deck, so they were taking people who were working amongst the crew, the reticulating staff, the porters and the chefs and the waiters and whatnot. They were giving them seats and telling them, hey, take command of this lifeboat. So while the first lifeboats are being launched, down below the crewmen are still fighting to maintain the vital services. The engineers and the firemen are still frantically working below in order to keep the boilers from exploding by venting the steam. They reopened some of the watertight doors and set up extra portable pumps in the forward compartments in a futile bid to reduce the torrent of water rushing in. And in the power plant, those guys were frantically working to keep the generators running, and they did up until about 2 minutes before the Titanic took its final plunge. All 8 of those guys remained at their posts to the very end, and all 8 of them were lost. And not only were the lights staying on, so the passengers weren't just fumbling around in total darkness, but this was also powering the radio. So what's going on up in the radio room at this time? Well, at the time that the iceberg struck the ship, it was said that Edward Smith entered the wireless room and told Phillips to prepare to send out a distress signal. Shortly after midnight, the captain returns to the room. He gives the operators kind of an estimated position, and he tells them to send out a distress signal and let him know if anybody responds. Now, the closest ship to Titanic at the time was the Californian. However, it had switched off its radio earlier in the night. And in fact, at 45 minutes after midnight, when Titanic fired the first of its rockets, or what we would call them today, emergency flares, the crew of the Californian saw these flares. However, the captain decided to ignore them for whatever reason. So there were 2 operators in the wireless room, a man named Phillips and a man named Bride, and Phillips was the one who started sending out the distress signals, the CQD distress signal, and Bride was tasked with first taking the messages to Captain Smith to see what ships in the area were around to assist. Because remember, there are a lot of ships around in this area right now. It's a major shipping lane at the time. So while Phillips is sending out the CQD code, Bride comes in and jokingly reminds him, hey, you should use SOS. That's the new signal everybody's using now. And this may be your last chance to ever do it. And that spawns that myth that showed up after the disaster that says that the Titanic was the first one to use SOS. However, it had been used before, but it's a good myth, right? So after a while of sending out this distress signal, the Carpathia picks it up and they start steaming right towards the scene. So after taking a quick break, Phillips returns to the wireless room and reports to Bride that the forward part of the ship was flooded and they should put on more clothes and life belts. And Bride, he starts to get ready and prepare while Phillips takes back control of the telegraph. Meanwhile, the power's getting weaker and weaker, so the area of the ship that was a radio room was actually a couple of different rooms. And as the electricity starts to fail, the signal that they are outputting is getting weaker and weaker. However, in this other room, it was called like the silent room. It was where all this mechanical, electrical equipment was. And there was these two dials that could really be used to like dial in the strength of the electricity or whatever. And you can still see it on the footage today of when they went down and saw the radio room of Titanic. You could see where Bride was going into the room and kind of like increasing the signal strength all the way up until the end. And they stayed in this room up until about a little after 2 a.m. when the captain finally said, "Gentlemen, you've done your duty, you're relieved." But Phillips was still sitting there, still punching out that distress signal until the power eventually faded away and the room flooded. And there's an actual story related to the end of this. So as they're sitting there still punching out this signal, a crew member sneaks into the room and attempts to steal Phillips' life belt. So Bride, outraged at the behavior, attacked the man and may have hit him with an object. Either way, the guy hits the floor like a sack of potatoes. And as the water begins to flood the wireless room, the two just leave the guy where he's laying because screw that guy, right? And after the two leave the room, they split up. Phillips heads towards the back of the ship while Bride heads towards the front. Now Bride, he begins helping a bunch of people manhandle lifeboat collapsible B down off top of the officers' quarters. However, before they can really get it all set up, the area floods and it was washed off the deck upside down. Along with Bride, he was under the boat. He manages to like swing up and cling onto it and hold onto it with like 30 other guys, and they're eventually picked up by another lifeboat. Phillips is unfortunately never seen again. Some people believe that Phillips did make it to the lifeboat, however there's conflicting accounts. Some state that there was a dead man in one of the lifeboats that was Phillips and he was buried at sea. Others, like myself, believe that he probably never made it off the ship. By the time the collapsibles were being launched, that was about it. So skipping back in time a little bit, around 1:20 a.m., this is when it became apparent to just about everybody on board that the situation was dire. It's around this time when there's clear signs of panic settling in. People are scrambling now. And this is creating accidents when it comes to loading the lifeboats. And it's also around this time when a lot of the engineers and stokers and stuff in the forward part of the ship are basically forced to make their way upwards because the areas are flooded out by this time. And up on the decks, men are loading their wives and children into boats and saying their final goodbyes because they don't think they're going to be saved or rescued. Everybody knew at this time that the situation was dire and that not everyone was going to survive, and a lot of people were making their peace with that. And there are numerous accounts and stories about that, but I'm not going to go into them because this thing's already almost 2 hours long. So at 1:45 a.m., the last intelligible message from the ship is sent as the electrical system began to fail, and it was engine room full up to boilers. This was around the time the last of the lifeboats were being loaded, and there was this increasing rush to get to lifeboats. For example, when lifeboat number 14 was being lowered with 40 people aboard, there was this rush of a bunch of people to kind of get onto that boat. And 5th Officer Lowe, who was in charge of the boat, he pulls out his pistol and he fired 3 warning shots into the air in order to control this crowd. Around the same time, 1:40-ish a.m., collapsible boat C was launched and lifeboat number 2 was launched. Now, Officer Lightoller, he was still in charge of launching these boats, and when he went to launch lifeboat number 2, he noticed that it was full of men and not of the English-speaking variety. He later used the derogatory term Dagos in order to describe them. This is an ethnic slur that's primarily targeted at Italian-speaking peoples. But what happens is when he finds out that there are all these non-British men in this boat, he waves his revolver at them and evicts them from the boat. And when he realizes there are no other women or children to fill this boat in his immediate area, He launches it with only 25 women and children aboard, along with whatever able seaman or crewman was available to act as captain of this boat. At 1:55 a.m., lifeboat number 4 was being launched with the Lady Astor, and I guess it didn't matter to Lightoller that John Jacob Astor was like one of the richest men on the planet. He refused to allow Astor to board, even though 20 of the 60 available seats were unoccupied. Now, it's interesting what happens to some of the people that stay behind. A lot of them just accept their fate. They make no attempts to escape, and they just kind of accept stoically that they're going to die tonight. Now, personally, I don't think I would have that in me. I think in those final minutes when death seems imminent, I would be doing whatever I could to survive because I just enjoy life too much. But these guys really took it on the nose. So one story revolves around Collapsible Boat D, which was the last boat to be launched at 2:05 a.m. with 25 people aboard, which was just over half capacity. As it was being lowered, 2 men jumped from the deck onto the boat. If I had been there, I probably would have been one of those 2 men. Now, shortly before the boat launches, one of the seats is given to a first-class passenger named Edith Evans, and she actually gives up her place on the boat. And she's one of 4 women who perish in the disaster. Why she gave up her seat, who knows? And just to give a slight nod as to how dire the situation is and how people act in life and death situations, a lot of survivors all had this same eerie account. So during a mad rush for one of the last lifeboats, an officer who was attempting to control the crowd actually fired 2 shots into that crowd and killed 1 or 2 men. Reports vary. And then either at the realization of what he did or the realization of how dire the situation was, or maybe the mere thought that death by a bullet is a lot better than death by drowning and freezing, the officer then turns the gun upon himself. And that was the last anybody ever saw of that officer. Now, a lot of people claim that that officer was Murdoch. However, nobody knows for sure. This could be an exaggerated tale or an account that refers to the other officer who was firing the warning shots around the same time as these people swarmed towards this one boat. But we don't know. It could have been its own incident. And then there are accounts of what happened to the captain and Thomas Andrews, the designer of the ship. So we know that around 2 a.m. the captain committed a final tour of the deck, and this is around the time he relieved the radio officers, as well as other crew members. He essentially relieves them of duty, thanks them for their service, and he's quoted as saying, "Now it's every man for himself." After this, he comes across the guys who are attempting to launch Collapsible Boat A. He tells these guys, "Well, boys, do your best for the women and children and look out for yourselves." After this, he returns to the bridge. Now, accounts vary on what happens next. If you watch that 1997 film, he stands there on the bridge and goes down with the ship. It's a great film moment, but the reality is actually kind of murky. Several survivors, including the radio operator Harold Bride, state that they saw Smith jump overboard from the bridge. And a mess steward named Cecil Fitzpatrick later claimed to have seen Smith along with Andrews jump overboard before the ship took its final plunge. So we get some conflicting accounts. Now Andrews, he also elected to stay on the ship. He was reportedly last seen in the first-class smoking room after approximately 2:05 a.m. However, other reports suggest that Andrews may have been in the smoking room sometime before 1:40 and that he continued assisting with the evacuation up to the very end, even throwing deck chairs and anything that would float overboard to help the passengers who were going to be in the water. It's believed that he eventually leaves the first-class smoking room in order to find the captain, and they're believed to have jumped off the ship together as it took its final plunge. So as the ship descends below the waves, the stern starts to rise out of the water, and naturally this is where everybody flocks to. They flock to the stern. And out on the stern, as the ship is sinking and everybody knows they're about to die, there's a second-class passenger back there, a Catholic priest. And he's hearing last-minute confessions and absolutions. This also took place in the third-class kind of common room. There was this group of people in there listening to a priest basically do the same thing as they sat down there and accepted their fate. Of course, also back here at the stern near the first-class gymnasium was the band. Now, Titanic actually had 2 bands. One was a quintet led by Wallace Hartley that played after dinner and at religious services, while the other was a trio who played in the reception area and outside the cafe and restaurant. The two bands had separate music arrangements and libraries, and they did not play together before the sinking. So around 30 minutes after colliding with the iceberg, the two bands were probably called by Chief Purser McElroy or Captain Smith, nobody really knows, and ordered to play in the first class lounge. And they were told to play lively tunes, and the lively tunes of the day was ragtime, so they're playing all these great ragtime hits. And they were instructed to do this in order to create a upbeat, lively atmosphere instead of a grim, panicky one. So they stuck with the popular ragtime tunes. Now at some point they moved to the boat deck level of the first class entrance. However, there's no evidence that they ever went out onto the boat deck itself. According to eyewitnesses, they stayed inside and were seen at the top of the staircase in the first class entrance. Now, part of the enduring folklore was that the band played up until the ship took its final plunge. And that's kind of true, but a big part of the folklore as well is that their final song was Nearer My God to Thee. Now, while that does make a great and romantic story, it's not true. We don't know what their final song was. We have various accounts from survivors stating that the band did not play Nearer My God to Thee. Harold Bride, in his account, he said that he heard the band playing Ragtime and then Autumn Dream. And a lot of people corroborate this fact, and a lot of people say that, no, if they had played Nearer My God to Thee, they would have instantly recognized it, and the band never did. Because there was a certain kind of protocol on ships at the time whenever there was an emergency. Usually the ship's band would be informed to play bright, cheerful music just to calm the passengers and keep them from inciting panic. And this goes back to that kind of naive way of Victorian thinking that we're going to do what we can to keep the passengers as calm as possible. It's good intentioned, but humans just don't work like that. And there are even conflicting accounts as to when they stopped playing, so some accounts state that they played right up until the final plunge. Some survivors stated that they stopped playing a little earlier than that, about 30 minutes before the ship went down. Personally, I think it was a lot like the scene in the 97 film where they were just like, you know what are we doing? Nobody's paying attention to us anyway. Good luck. Let's try to make our way off this doomed ship. I just feel like that's more close to the actual reality of the situation. However, sadly, none of the band members would survive. So here we are, we're around 2:15 a.m. now, and the ship is starting to rise out of the water. Titanic is in its final throes. People are panicking, they're swarming towards the stern. The water has come up over the bow and it's flooding in through the deck hatches. The parties who were trying to launch collapsible boats A and B were swept away along with the two boats. Now, collapsible B, that was the one that floated away upside down. That was the one that the wireless operator Bride managed to get onto. And collapsible boat A, it floats away partially flooded with its canvas not raised. So around this time, our one officer, Lightoller, he was attempting to launch collapsible B and realized it would be futile to head aft. So he dives overboard from the roof of the officer's quarters, and he's actually sucked into the mouth of a ventilation shaft, but was, quote, blown clear by a terrific blast of hot air. And remember, this is due to the work of our heroes who, some of them were still down in the bowels of the ship. The ones that were left were towards the stern, keeping the lights on and whose hard work prevented those boilers from exploding. So this blast of hot air shoots him out of this ventilation shaft like a cannonball, and he emerges right next to the capsized lifeboat. Talk about a wild ride. However, it's around this time when the forward funnel collapses under its own weight. And it comes down and it crushes people and it nearly crushes the lifeboat. And according to Lightoller, when the first funnel collapsed, it created a wave that pushed the lifeboat that he was clinging to 50 yards clear of the ship, which was a good thing in hindsight because you wanted to get away from the ship because the suction was pulling people down. Because when you have that much water rushing into the hull of a ship, it sucks down everything with it. It's like something going down a bathtub drain. So the idea of the people in these lifeboats was to get as far away from this goddamn ship as possible to avoid being sucked down with it. Now, those still on Titanic, they claimed that they could feel the entire structure shuddering as it underwent these immense stresses. And one first-class passenger, a man named Jack Thayer, he describes it as the following. Occasionally there had been a muffled thud or deadened explosion within the ship. Now without warning she seemed to start forward, moving forward and into the water at an angle of about 15 degrees. This movement, with the water rushing up towards us, was accompanied by a rumbling roar, mixed with more muffled explosions. It was like standing under a steel railway bridge while an express train passes overhead, mingled with the noise of a pressed steel factory and a wholesale breakage of china. So eyewitnesses say they saw the stern rising high into the air as the ship tilted down in the water. It was said to have reached an angle of 30 to 45 degrees. At this time, many of the survivors described a great noise, some which attributed to the boilers exploding. After this, the ship's lights flickered once and then were permanently extinguished. There were roughly 1,500 people still aboard the ship, clinging to just about anything they could cling to. Some were clinging onto the railing of the stern, some were climbing up the back of the stern, others were diving into the icy cold water, trying to escape this shaking ship. And then in its final moments, the extreme opposing forces of the flooded bow pulling her down while the air-filled stern holding her up just couldn't take it, and at the weakest point, the ship from top to bottom begins to break in two. After this, the stern settled and then rapidly flooding before taking its final plunge. At 2:20 a.m., only 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking the iceberg, the Titanic was no more. It was on its way to its final resting place at the bottom of the ocean, where it remains to this very day. And almost instantly, the sensationalism, the news stories, the inquiries, the questions of just what the hell happened were just flooding the world. How did this multi-million-dollar ship with the latest technology, the finest luxury, the largest ship in the world said to be unsinkable, sink on its maiden voyage? And at the end of the day, even though the parent company of White Star Line, International Mercantile Marine Company, was able to, weasel out a responsibility along with White Star Line, it all came down to a combination of negligence, inexperience, and out-of-date regulations. Now, a lot of people push the blame onto the captain, stating that he was set in his ways and he was doing things that were unsafe, he took a lot of liberties, he was ignoring ice warnings, blah, blah, blah. However, we see that in his actions on that final night, and this is corroborated with eyewitness accounts that he maintained a cool head and was making a lot of rapid decisions in the moment. However, it's also known that he was only aware of maybe one or two of the ice warnings, and he was aware of the fact and made his crew aware of the fact that there was potential ice in the area and to be on lookout for it. However, a captain is only as good as his crew, and we saw from his crew that there was a lot of inexperience. Nobody was really experienced with these disasters. I mean, you had 29 able seamen on a ship with over 2,000 passengers. And this was a time when things like drills and procedure when it came to communication, even communication amongst your officers on a ship, were not really practiced. It really does come down to man's hubris. They're like, oh, we built this great ship, it's gonna be fine, let's just full steam ahead, blah, 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 don't worry about all this stuff. And that's very human, right? When you're in that state of everything's fine, everything's perfect, don't worry about it, that's when disaster strikes. And if you've never dealt with disaster before, you're gonna react in a very disastrous way. You're probably gonna make it worse. However, this disaster and these inquiries really changed the game. It led to the formation of a lot of safety regulations that are still out there today. So at least we can say some good came out of it. However, the mysteries don't end with the sinking of the ship. There are some other mysteries that are still out there and still surrounding this ship that are kind of odd that I want to get into in this last little segment. So the most crazy, outrageous story out there when it comes to the Titanic comes from one of its survivors, and just this very strange way he was able to survive. So this is the story of Titanic's chief baker, a man named Charles Jogan, and he went through the entire disaster completely drunk. And we can obviously see why I love this story so much. It's another story in which alcohol saves lives. So Charles was the chief baker aboard Titanic, and he was a tough old boot. So as the ship strikes the iceberg, he's asleep in his quarters, and this obviously wakes him up from his slumber. So he gets out of his bunk, and he gets word that the officers are getting ready to start launching lifeboats. So he gets his men together, his other bakers, his underlings, there's 13 of them, and he sends them up to the boat deck with the provisions for the lifeboats, 4 loaves of bread apiece and about 40 pounds of bread each. Now, it said that Jogan, he stays behind for a time, probably drinking, but he arrives up on the boat deck at about 12:30 a.m. So he goes up on deck and he joins Chief Officer Henry Wilde and begins assisting these people into these lifeboats, along with some other stewards and seamen that are there. So they start loading some of these women and children onto the lifeboat when a bunch of the ladies say, "No, we're safer on the ship. I'm not getting in that little boat." And they leave. And then Charles, he's like, "The fuck you are?" So he goes down to A deck and he's like dragging women and children up to the boat deck and like tossing them in this boat. The quote is, "He forcibly brought up women and children and threw them into the lifeboat." This was obviously a guy who knew exactly what was happening and just did not give a fuck. Now, as Lifeboat 10 is ready to launch, he's actually assigned to be the captain of this lifeboat. But he refuses because the boat was already being crewed by 2 sailors and a steward. So he just wanders off to go get a drop of the liquor, specifically a tumbler and a half full of liquor, as he specified later. And a tumbler is like one of those glasses you would get at a restaurant for water. So that's a lot of liquor. So suffice it to say, he was sauced out of his mind. So he's in his quarters getting drunk, and then he comes back upstairs, and that's where he says he met with the old doctor. It was probably one of the ship's doctors, a man named William O. Loughlin, and this was quite possibly the last time anybody ever saw him again. So when he arrives up on the boat deck, he sees that all of the other lifeboats had been lowered. So he goes down to A deck on the promenade and he starts throwing the deck chairs overboard to act as flotation devices. It was said that he threw about 50 deck chairs overboard. He then goes to the deck pantry on A deck to, quote, get a drink of water. Yeah, I'm sure it was water. And whilst there, he heard a loud crash as if part of the ship had buckled. This was probably the point where the ship was starting to break up. So he leaves the pantry and he joins the crowd, who are now all running aft towards the poop deck. And as he was crossing the well deck, which is kind of the lower part of a deck, the ship suddenly gave a list over to port, and according to him, threw everyone in the well in a bunch except for him. So he climbs to the starboard side of the poop deck and gets hold of the safety rail so that he was on the outside of the ship as it went down. And I remind you, at this time, the Titanic, the stern is up at like a 30-degree angle. And there's chaos and screaming and people are falling overboard and throwing themselves overboard. They're saying their prayers, they know they're about to die, and this guy's just calm as a cucumber, probably because he was drunk as fuck. He states that as the ship started to go down, he rode it down as if it was an elevator, and then as it just goes below the surface, he just steps off. He said that he didn't even get his hair wet. Now, the shock of hitting ice cold water is what killed a lot of people at this point. A lot of them didn't drown, they died from the sheer shock of hitting that ice cold water, while many others succumbed to hypothermia. However, old Charles, he was completely undeterred by this. So here we are, the last person to ever physically touch the Titanic is just casually swimming around in the ocean as if it were nothing. He then basically doggy paddles and treads water for about 2 hours, and when asked how he did this, he was like, it was nothing, it was like swimming in a pond, which is like, okay. So after about 2 hours of this, he spots collapsible lifeboat B and swims over towards it. This was the one that was floating around upside down that Second Officer Lightoller kind of shot up right next to. And there's about 30 men kind of standing on this lifeboat. However, old Charles, he can't really get on. There's just no real room for him. So he's kind of just there, just hanging out, kind of holding on to this boat still in the water, no big deal, until they spot another lifeboat and he's able to swim over to it and just get up there and get on. He doesn't have any signs of frostbite, he doesn't have any hypothermia, he's just sound as a pound. The only really thing he had was his feet were a little bit swollen and he was still drunk as fuck. And it goes down as this almost supernatural or monumental feat because we know they have that rumor that says that, well, liquor will warm you up. Well, it actually does the opposite. And a lot of people ask, how could this man stay alive for more than 2 hours in the water while other people died within minutes? And the only real answer was it was down to his calm and cool demeanor. He never once panicked. He did get drunk. I imagine he probably had a massive hangover that next day, but I digress. However, this guy, he was able to survive. And to be honest, it's probably just a testament to the power of the mind. And this was a guy who spent the next 40 years serving on ships. He retired around the end of World War II, finally passing away in 1956 at the age of 78. But that's just a wild story. Like, nobody was expected to survive more than 10 minutes in that water. And this guy survived 2 hours plus. Of course, there were other mysteries that came out after Titanic sank too. For one, a lot of people didn't believe that the ship had broken in half. It wasn't until it was rediscovered in the 1980s when that was confirmed as true. For a long time, it was thought that it was a myth that it broke in half. And speaking of the structure, there are some other little telltale conspiracies involving that. So one involves the hull plates themselves. They believe that they used a cheaper type of iron in order to save costs. And this cheaper iron with these cheaper rivets gave way too easily, and that caused the flooding of the ship. Now that one's mostly been debunked. It's known that most of the steel on the ship and iron was pretty much the best they could produce at the time with the technology they had. And it's pretty much been widely proven that there were no cost-cutting measures in the construction of Titanic. Now, one theory about the ship that got a lot of traction due to a 1998 book was that the Titanic didn't sink at all, and the ship that actually sank was the Olympic. And this was all part of an insurance scam. So there's this author, and they were doing all this research into the Titanic and the Olympic, basically White Star Line, I guess. And I guess they were looking at some of the weird stuff that happened around the Olympic. So on the Olympic's fifth voyage, it actually collided with another ship called the Hawk, and it caused extensive damage. Now, there was an inquiry into this wreck. It was found that the Olympic was responsible, White Star Line was responsible, and was forced to eat the cost of damages and repairs. So the gist of the idea is it would be better if we could just sink Olympic and collect an insurance payout. But doing this so soon after a accident and all these fines and stuff would be too suspicious, so they decide to take Olympic and swap it out with Titanic. And then if the Olympic happened to, I don't know, sink in heavy pack ice or something, they'd get a massive insurance payout. And it would be the Titanic disaster. Titanic would then sail on as Olympic for the rest of its life. And there you go. It's a good conspiracy, I guess, but it's all easily debunkable over elaborate bullshit. By the time Titanic launched, Olympic had been sailing for a while, and Titanic had extensive interior renovations which made it stand out from Olympic. So anybody that had ever sailed on Olympic prior would be able to tell the difference between Olympic and Titanic, especially if the ships had been switched. So while fun, it's more like an overly elaborate kind of plan that you would see in a supervillain movie. That easily falls apart as soon as you pull a single thread. But I guess the author got a book out of it, so there you go. There was also a conspiracy theory that states that Titanic was deliberately sunk by the likes of J.P. Morgan because some of the passengers who were on the ship at the time were American millionaires and very influential and were against the creation of the Federal Reserve or a central bank. However, this is also an overly elaborate scheme that sounds like it's out of a supervillain movie. And it's all linked together by very dubious connections, like J.P. Morgan. He had a hand in creating the Federal Reserve. He also had a big interest in the International Mercantile Company, which own White Star Line, so obviously it's a big conspiracy, right? And I am currently losing my voice, listen to that. But I guess when one talks nonstop about Titanic for like 6 recording sessions over the course of a week, and I'm not counting the recording sessions I'm doing for my season finale, which I'm already well into creating, but I digress. But on that note, I have rambled about Titanic for over 2 hours now. I just want to say one more thing about booze. So on Titanic, there were 20,000 bottles of beer and stout, 1,500 bottles of wine, including a lot of champagne and Bordeaux, 850 bottles of spirits, including vermouth, cognac, brandy, and whiskey, and 8,000 cigars. And apart from the portion that was consumed by old Charles, a lot of that spilled out onto the ocean floor and is still down there to this day. And the champagne has been found in pristine condition. Now, while the wine has turned to vinegar and the beer and stout is probably all skunked, the champagne has been found in near perfect condition. And one of those bottles, a vintage 1907 Heidesex Gut American, was recovered being stored in the right conditions of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. This bottle sold for $275,000, and we know that this champagne is still good because it's still known to have carbonation. And this is the crazy thing. So there was another shipwreck in 1916 in the Baltic Sea, and they were carrying 3,000 bottles of this stuff. And they recovered some of this exact same champagne in 1998 and actually tasted it, and it said that it had evolved into a fantastic tasting champagne. Now, I don't really know where I'm going with this. I just kind of wanted to talk about that, but I thought it was a cool story that I wanted to tack on the end here. But as always, this is Mike, and if you made it this far, then God damn, you truly had nothing better to do the last 2 hours. Unless you skipped that whole 40-minute tirade and came in at the last hour. If you did, screw you. You call yourself a fan. But anyways, I do truly thank you for listening to what has now become my longest episode ever. From the outset, I always wanted to do some kind of documentary or something about Titanic. It's just a ship and a disaster. It's always fascinated me. So I'm glad I finally got the chance to do that. Now, I know this wasn't typical. I didn't get into a whole bunch of spooky, macabre, conspiratorial stuff. But I've always wanted to tell the story of the disaster my way, leaving out all the flack and just throwing the facts out there. And to be honest, a 2-hour documentary barely scratches the surface. There are endless rabbit holes when it comes to this ship. There's a world of stuff that I didn't even get into, but maybe in the future. But as I said, as always, I thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one, and that will be the season 4 finale. And spoiler alert, it's Jack the Ripper.